Inventing Reality. Section. Twists and Turns. To justify military intervention in places like Vietnam and Laos, the United States found another great red menace to go along with the USSR, now accusing the People's Republic of China of being the purveyor of something called, quote, Asian communism. By the 1960s, the word was out. Red China, an awesome giant, armed with nuclear weapons and bent on regional and world domination, was U.S. public enemy number one. This image was fortified by pronouncements emanating from Peking itself. While Soviet leaders tirelessly advocated peaceful coexistence and said relatively little about Third World revolutions, China called for, quote, wars of national liberation, and denounced the United States as an imperialist paper tiger. In lockstep with official policy, the U.S. news media began depicting China as a menacing, quote, extremist nation populated by hundreds of millions of communist fanatics. By the early 1960s, newspaper political cartoons no longer caricatured Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev as a threatening figure, but as a pudgy, almost benign personage, overshadowed by an awesome, slanty-eyed giant labeled, quote, Red China. In the mid-1970s, after suffering setbacks in Indochina, Angola, and Mozambique, and confronted with a deepening recession at home, U.S. policymakers once more began to portray the Soviet Union as a growing menace to U.S. security, and as a purveyor of Third World revolutions. While the actual material assistance the Soviets gave to liberation struggles was, with the exception of Vietnam, not all that great, and in some cases non-existent, Moscow did offer political and moral support, and did aid nations like Cuba, which in turn directly assisted leftist insurgents in places like Angola. In contrast, the Chinese attacked the Soviet Union for being the great aggressor and instigator of, quote, social imperialism. At the same time, Peking cultivated sympathetic relations with reactionary governments and counter-revolutionary forces in various countries. The U.S. media again mirrored the shift in official policy, discovering that China was no longer a menacing giant, nor a mindless anthill, but was inhabited by human beings who liked to play ping pong, sip soda, and even fall in love and do a turn on the dance floor. The, quote, fanatical Asian communists were now described as, quote, moderate. According to Newsweek, Peking's post-Maoist leaders were putting, quote, China's house in order, and presiding, quote, over a strongly entrenched and resolutely pragmatic government. In 1978, Peking's top man, Vice Premier Deng, appeared in cover portrait as Time magazine's, quote, Man of the Year. Press reports also talked of mass discontent, poverty, instability, lagging production, and other signs of political and economic disarray in China. As a national entity, China was accorded a more favorable representation in the U.S. media. But Chinese socialism was still described in essentially negative terms. The American public was not to mistake the improvement in Sino-U.S. relations as a sign of approval for China's economic system. In contrast, the Soviet Union was once more the Red Menace. Almost on cue, alarmist stories appeared in the news media about the superiority of Soviet military capabilities. During this period, Soviet advisors were kicked out of Egypt and Somalia. A massive country like China seemingly switched over to the Western camp. Poland experienced widespread unrest. and the revolutionary government in Afghanistan proved so unstable as to cause the Soviets to commit themselves to a politically and militarily costly intervention. Yet the USSR was portrayed in the press as an inexorably successful foe, winning victory after victory, posing a mounting threat to US security. The accession of Ronald Reagan to the White House brought with it a confrontational belligerency not displayed by American policymakers since the 1950s. In his first press conference as president, Reagan declared that the Soviet Union's goal was to impose, quote, a one-world socialist or communist state over the entire globe. Quote, they commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to obtain that, end quote. The United States, Reagan observed, had no choice but to counter the USSR's aggrandizing moves, wherever possible. As if on cue, the national media took up the cry. The press seldom mentioned Moscow's calls for rapprochement. Instead, references were to Soviet global expansionism by a, quote, totalitarian Soviet system that, quote, poses the most serious military threat and political challenge facing the West, end quote. The news media revived Cold War stereotypes that had been dormant for over a decade of détente. Soviet concerns were now Soviet designs. The Soviet Union was once again the, quote, Soviet Empire. Soviet defenses were now Soviet attack capabilities. Soviet leaders were once more, quote, ruthless Kremlin power brokers, whose main interest in life was power for power's sake. Media pundits and columnists speculated with chilling calm about the likelihood of nuclear war with the Russians. Within a short period during 1981, officialdom and the press put World War III back on the agenda, treating the public to a steady diet of, quote, delivery systems, civil defense evacuations, throw weight, and retaliatory capability. All the grotesque Dr. Strangelove imagery that had been considered an aberration of the nuclear-minded 1950s again became part of the mainstream media's vocabulary. As in the 1950s, so in the 1980s. The Red Menace theme so saturated the media and the opinion climate that even left-leaning and progressive publications felt obliged to lay down an anti-Soviet barrage of a kind they had not found necessary during détente. Skittish liberal and leftist intellectuals, concerned above all with their credibility, once more shifted with the prevailing tide and flashed their anti-Soviet, or anti-Marxist, anti-communist, or even just anti-class analysis credentials, sometimes in articles or reviews, more often in parenthetical, almost casual asides, just enough to cover themselves. The ploy is a familiar one, dating back to the McCarthy era, when one sought to establish one's political respectability by anti-communist and anti-Soviet genuflection. However, this outpouring only strengthened the very Cold War mania and anti-communist orthodoxy that intellectuals ostensibly opposed. Rather than creating more space for themselves, they created less. Those who refused to play this game were called, quote, hardliners, orthodox Marxists, quote, Soviet apologists, and the like, and were treated as pariahs within the left itself. Though many of them were actually critical of features within Soviet society, their sin was that they had the temerity also to see positive attributes. This was something the Me Too anti-communist leftists would not tolerate. the, quote, hardliners, had failed the legitimacy test. In the early 1980s, the Soviets, 1. Asked for another round of arms limitation agreements, 2. Unilaterally supported a no first-use nuclear pledge and repeatedly invited the United States to do likewise, 3. Offered to reduce the number of their medium-range missiles in Europe from 600 to 162, 4. Unilaterally put a freeze on any further deployment of their updated medium-range SS-20 missiles, 5. Urged the Americans to refrain from deploying their more advanced Pershing II and cruise missiles, 6. Called for a ban of all weapons in outer space, and 7. Proposed a 25% cutback in intercontinental strategic missiles. These kinds of conciliatory gestures were either ignored by the press or dismissed as, quote, initiatives in a, quote, propaganda war. While the Soviets were calling for arms cutbacks, U.S. News and World Report, November 22, 1982, was alerting its readers to an, quote, unremitting Soviet arms buildup. A CIA report released in December 1982 contradicted the, quote, arms buildup charge, noting that the share of Soviet GNP devoted to the military had, quote, increased slightly since 1965. But this datum went largely unreported in the press. On December 22, 1982, both the Supreme Soviet and the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party unanimously approved a nuclear weapons freeze resolution virtually identical to the version that had been passed by numerous municipalities and states throughout the United States. An action that went unreported by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, the major networks, and just about all U.S. media. The campaign against the Red Menace was not exclusively a media creation, but reflected the interests of the dominant corporate political class of which the media is a part. The twists and turns of media anti-communist alarmism largely paralleled similar shifts in an official policy that was and still is dedicated to making life safe for corporate capitalism at home and abroad. It is not enough to denounce this anti-communist policy as a product of wrong thinking. We must also try to understand why it has been so functional to the interests that nurture it. In truth, the real threat to the, quote, American way of life has come not from without the system, but from within, in the form of poverty, unemployment, a decline in real wages, inequitable tax burdens, urban blight, and environmental devastation and attacks on our civil liberties. With economic crises and material injustices, there often come popular unrest, strikes, demonstrations, riots, sit-ins, and a threatened disruption of class order. The Red Menace image propagated by government and media repeatedly attempted to direct popular discontent away from domestic realities and toward imaginary foes. Not the capitalist system, but those who criticized it were made the problem. The crisis within the system was transformed into an external threat against it. Just as Hitler sought to blame Germany's misery on the Jews, so U.S. political leaders, with the help of media opinion makers, targeted the Reds. Holding the Red Menace at bay became the preoccupation of our national leaders and national media. It also served as justification for a U.S. global military machine, armed interventions abroad, a nuclear arms race, a gargantuan military budget, and a highly profitable armaments industry. Throughout the superpowers negotiations of the 1980s, the media continued to portray the White House as ready for improved relations, and the Soviets as recalcitrant and belligerent. When President Reagan declared he was going to abrogate the SALT II treaty that limited nuclear arms, CBS's Dan Rather announced, May 27, 1986, quote, "President Reagan prodded Moscow again on arms control," end quote. A few weeks later, June 19th, Rather described another of the president's talks as, quote, "prodding the Soviets." He prodded them both on arms control and a new summit meeting, end quote. Soviet attempts to cap the arms race and develop better East-West relations were regularly dismissed as manipulative, quote, "public relations campaigns, propaganda ploys, and posturing." An ABC newscaster, July 16, 1989, discussing the Soviet offer of a comprehensive test ban on nuclear weapons, reduced it to, quote, "the Kremlin's smile campaign, designed to influence the Western allies." The offer, he added, represented a tactical departure from previously unsuccessful, quote, "strong-arm methods." He did not specify what those methods were. The implicit conclusion was that the Soviet proposal was inherently suspect because it came from the Soviets. In the news coverage of the 1988 Moscow summit, the only American views publicized were those of the White House and ultra-conservative U.S. critics, who were even further to the right than President Reagan. The media gave generous coverage to these critics, who were displeased with the prospect of friendlier relations with Moscow. The public was left with the impression that the conservative Ronald Reagan represented the only alternative American perspective on U.S.-Soviet affairs. Progressive views were virtually shut out, including criticisms of the U.S. government's pursuit of space weaponry, Star Wars, its unwillingness to agree to a ban on underground nuclear bomb tests offered by the Soviets, and its failure to note the human rights abuses within U.S.-supported client states, while harping on Soviet violations. When U.S. peace activists spoke in Moscow, the Washington Post declared on its front page, quote, "Disgruntled U.S. peaceniks participate in Soviet leadership's counteroffensive," end quote. Using the stale pejorative peaceniks 3 times, the Post labored to portray these American dissidents as tools of the Kremlin. At the president's news conference in Moscow, NBC's Andrea Mitchell asked how the president felt about the fact that Soviet officials kept dossiers on dissidents. But neither she nor anyone else made any mention of the FBI's extensive maintenance of dossiers on U.S. protesters and dissenters. End of section.